What if the one rule everyone told you would keep you alive was actually a death trap? In the summer of 1943, that question haunted the skies over France, where pilots chanted a doctrine-like prayer: altitude is life. They lived by it, briefed by it, trusted it, and still, the empty chairs kept piling up. From high above the countryside, the world looked like a safe, ordered map. From below, it was anything but. This isn't just a story about planes and tactics. It's about a desperate, rule-breaking gamble that turned the supposed sanctuary of height into a graveyard, and the terrifying idea that the only way to survive might be to fly down. An American P47 Thunderbolt cruises at 18,000 feet, each piston thrum a steady heartbeat under the canopy. From the cockpit, the world below is a sprawling map: patchwork fields, narrow ribbons of road, villages like postage stamps, green and brown, in an endless, indifferent pattern. The pilot squints through sun-silvered glass, reading hedgerows and rooftops like a chart, gauges humming their steady reassurance. Wind and oil smell the only things that reach him through the metal skin. Up here, everything seems calm, almost deceptively so. It's easy to imagine safety when the earth looks so small, but that comfort hangs on a razor's edge. This altitude is supposed to be a sanctuary, a buffer against the chaos below. Up here you trade threat for time, altitude for options, the world reduced to neat patterns on a map. Pilots tell themselves that gravity and distance will buy them a chance to react. In training, it's preached like scripture: climb, climb, climb. Yet the men who flew these missions gave it a colder name: the graveyard in the sky. The irony is brutal. What feels like safety becomes a spotlight. From 18,000 feet, a P-47 can look serene and helpless at the same time, perfectly exposed to a hunter who knows how to dive. But there is no safety here. At 18,000 feet, the P-47's bulk becomes a liability, a slow, silver fish in a barrel, glinting in the sun, an easy silhouette against the bright sky. Up here, its weight steals maneuverability. Its size makes it a beacon. You can feel the exposure like a hand on your throat. Every second stretches, every glance could be the last. Miles away, unseen, a German in a faster climbing Bf-109 catches a flash of sunlight off the Thunderbolt's skin, and the world narrows to a single silhouette. He peels away, trading height for attitude, the needle of his altimeter a countdown. In minutes, he closes like a thrown spear, streaking down through haze, engines screaming, guns primed. There is no warning for the P-47 pilot. The hunt begins. The reality of this air war is brutal. American fighter pilots are dying faster than they can be replaced. Squadrons bleed men, veterans gone in a single mission, rookies sent up to fill the hole the next day. Mess halls grow quieter. Briefings start to sound like roll calls of ghosts. Ground crews patch up aircraft with shaking hands, while chaplains write names into ledgers. The training pipeline can't spit out experience on demand. Experience is what keeps you alive, and it's the first thing they're losing. Commanders trade furious reports and hollow apologies, and the reason becomes painfully clear. Up high, the enemy owns the sky. It wasn't an exaggeration. The Luftwaffe owned the operational ceiling between 15 and 25,000 feet. Up there, the Germans set the tempo. Radar, tactics, engines, and pilots all optimized for thin air and high-speed interceptions. For an American Thunderbolt, that band of sky wasn't a refuge, it was a death strip. Climb into it, and you became a slow, luminous target silhouetted against the sun. The advantage of altitude had been weaponized against them. Until someone questioned the rule, every pilot who kept his height was gambling with his life. Between 15 and 25,000 feet, the Luftwaffe held dominion, and at the center of that rule were two fighters, the BF-109 and the FW-190. Built and tuned for thin air performance, they climbed like rockets, converted altitude into devastating speed, and kept their energy where American planes often could not up high. Light, nimble frames, powerful engines, heavy cannon, and pilots drilled in snap interceptions made them terrifyingly effective. From that height, they could pick a lone Thunderbolt, trade altitude for velocity, and vanish into the sun, then turn the sky into a kill zone in seconds. They've turned the sun into a blind. A messer climbs higher, slips into the glare, then dives nose down, cannons spitting an orchestrated, brutal ballet. Tracers stitch the sky. Smoke and metal erupt around the American plane. There's no long fight, no warning. It's over in heartbeats. A wing shears off, a silver shape tumbles, and the hunter is gone. In seconds, it's over. A sun-silvered BF-109 flashes from the glare, guns chattering, and the Thunderbolt takes the hit metal shrieks as a wing shears off like paper. Fire blooms along the fuselage, smoke streaming back in a black banner as the plane yawns and tumbles, instruments rattling. No time to react, no warning. One moment flying, the next fighting to stay whole. Often, the American pilot never even saw his attacker. He never knew he was in a fight. One moment the world was a calm map beneath his wheels. The next, a brutal white flash from above, a thunderbolt of metal and fire that chewed through wing and fuel in a heartbeat. Instruments went fuzzy. Controls kicked back. There was no time to call for help, no time to angle, no time to pray. You could be looking down at patchwork fields 1 second and spiraling toward them the next, bewildered and blinded, surprised by death from the sky, more ghost than enemy, gone before you could name him. Back at the base, every mission briefing feels like a eulogy waiting to be written. Men gather around the map table in a hush, glancing at empty chairs and photographs taped to lockers, trading thin smiles that don't reach their eyes. A captain reads the sortie list, and you can hear the catch-in-the-room names that might be gone by sunset. Coffee goes cold, boots shuffle. Casualty reports sit folded like bad news in an envelope no one wants to open. Pilots run through checklists with mechanical calm because saying the words keeps the fear at bay. Beneath it all, there's a quiet, ugly question settling in the air. Back at the base, briefings have the tone of funerals, but the doctrine that greets every pilot is almost liturgical. Altitude is life. It's hammered into rookies and veterans alike, shouted from the lectern, scrawled on bulletin boards, murmured over bacon and coffee, a one-line catechism you repeat until it feels true. Climb, don't engage. Keep the height, keep your chances. Altimeters become talismans. The sky above is sanctuary, the ground below a place of last resort. The rule is simple, absolute, unquestioned, a cold, clean logic that everyone trusts. Because what else can you trust in war? The rule is simple and absolute. Never, ever give up your height advantage. It isn't just advice, it's doctrine, drilled into every pilot from day one until it becomes reflex. A slogan on the briefing sheet, a prayer muttered before takeoff. Pilots learn to measure safety in feet and miles, to treat altitude like armor. In the air, every decision bends around that one command: climb, climb, climb. It organizes formations, it dictates tactics, it shapes fear into habit. So they keep their noses up. They cling to the thin blue ceiling, trusting that the higher they fly, the safer they'll be, even as the cost quietly mounts. But this gospel, this one sacred rule, is getting them all killed. It's drilled into every pilot until it's more prayer than tactic. Altitude is life. Carry your height like an amulet, and you'll come home. And yet the numbers don't lie. Cheerful flight lines emptied into telegrams, bunks at the mess hall growing cold, clutching hands and broken radios. Obedience becomes ritual, discipline a slow procession toward the same fiery fate. The higher they climb, the better the target they become. Somewhere in that mounting pile of loss, a single stubborn question begins to leak through the dogma. Major Hub Zemke sees it. Major Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, sees the cost every single day. He walks past bunks and into the mess hall, and the empty chair is its own tally mark. Laughing boys one day, missing names the next. He watches pilots file into briefings like sheep to the slaughter, disciplined, obedient, repeating the old prayer, altitude is life. He notices it in the quiet after a mission, in the way grief settles into uniforms and maps. Each loss sharpens the question in his chest until doctrine looks less like guidance and more like a slow, efficient death sentence. He sees it in the empty chairs at the mess hall places that had been a riot of laughter and cigarette smoke and too loud stories just hours earlier. Coffee cups sit cold. A half-eaten piece of pie goes stiff under a fork. A jacket slung over the back of a seat waits for a body that will never return. The silence is obscene, an accusation that settles over him heavier than any casualty report. Each vacant place is a name, a number, a life erased between one mission briefing and the next. And Zemke feels the weight of every empty chair like a ledger of failures he cannot and will not ignore. He watches his men move like clockwork, salutes sharp, helmets clipped, the doctrine whispered like a prayer before every sortie. Altitude is life. He watches them file into the Thunderbolts with the same calm, practiced confidence they'd been taught since flight school. He watches them climb to that cherished safety and become silhouettes against the sun. He watches their laughter in the mess hall turn into silence at briefing tables, empty chairs where boys used to sit. He watches disciplined precision turn into ritualized sacrifice. He watches them do everything right, and he watches them die for it, and the sight lands in his chest like a stone. The losses are catastrophic and unsustainable. Squadrons that left the field intact come back with smoking holes where wings used to be, bunks at the mess hall stay empty, and the casualty reports pile up faster than replacements can arrive. Pilots who learned the same gospel, altitude is life, recite it like prayer, even as it guides them into predictable slaughter. The numbers don't lie. The doctrine that was supposed to protect them is now the clearest path to the grave. The math is brutal, and the conclusion is inescapable. Something is fundamentally wrong with their strategy, and someone will have to break the rules to prove it. In the chow lines and casualty sheets, Major Hub Zemke feels it an idea that feels criminal simply to consider, what if the doctrine itself is killing them? He'd spent a career worshiping the mantra, altitude is life, repeating it like prayer, drilling it into fresh pilots until it became gospel. Now, that gospel looks like a funeral march. The thought isn't tidy or comfortable, it's jagged, dangerous, immediate. To question the sacred rule is to invite courts-martial, to risk careers and reputations. But staring at empty bunks and grieving friends, Zemke's moral arithmetic shifts obedience or survival, and the forbidden option slides into place, impossible to ignore. He looks at the sky, the place of supposed safety, and sees only a killing field. Where other men find distance and comfort, he feels the cold arithmetic of loss. Silver canopies that hide bullets, altimeters that count down funerals, contrails like thin lines on a casualty list. Every bomber silhouette becomes a mark. Every climb feels like a promise to never come home. The old mantra, altitude is life, now sounds less like doctrine and more like a prayer at a wake. The more he watches, the more the sky reads like a trap, and a dangerous question starts to pry its way into his mind. The question crystallizes, sharp and dangerous. What if the doctrine is wrong? It lands like a stone in Zemke's gut, disrupting everything he's been taught to revere the prayer that altitude equals safety. For years, that rule has been their map and their coffin, repeated in briefings and carved into training manuals until no one dared imagine otherwise. Now, staring at casualty lists and empty chairs, the doubt refuses to be wished away. It's not a clever thought. It's not theoretical. It's survival calculus that contradicts doctrine. If the sky is a killing field, then maybe the answer isn't up there at all. Maybe it's down. What if the answer to their survival isn't up in the thin, cold air? That question lands like a stone in every briefing room, skidding across polished tables and stubborn training manuals. For years, the gospel was simple. Climb, hold the altitude, never trade height for anything. It felt sacred. It felt safe. But safety had become a lie. The men who obeyed it were turning into statistics. So the thought that follows is dangerous and necessary at once. Maybe the place they'd been told was salvation was actually a trap. Maybe, if you strip away pride and doctrine, the only real option left is something nobody has dared try. What if the answer is down? All the way down. The thought lands like a grenade, sudden, obscene, impossible. Everything they'd been taught. Every briefing mantra altitude is life collapses into a single dangerous image. Flying so low the hedgerows scrape your belly, so low the ground becomes your enemy and your ally at once. It is tactical heresy. Manuals call it suicide. Instructors shout warnings about wires, ambushes, the blind terror of losing skyward sight. And yet the numbers on his desk don't lie. The question isn't comfortable. It's not safe. But it might be the only way out. It wasn't just risky. It was tactical insanity. Every training manual, every instructor, every veteran pilot said the same thing, like a prayer you never questioned: altitude is life. To suggest otherwise was to invite scorn, to risk a ruined career, or worse, a court-martial, a lecture, the cold stare of men who'd buried friends by the dozen. Pilots muttered the word suicide when low-level flying came up. And yet, in the quiet hours of the mess hall and over casualty reports, that forbidden question kept returning, stubborn and hungry. Compared to what? Down on the deck, everything changes. The horizon squashes. The world closes in. Trees become a green blur. The ground a roaring wall beneath your belly. And the sky, the space where threats used to live, feels impossibly far away. You can't scan for attackers. You can't watch the sun for a glint of a fighter pulling a kill shot. A plane diving out of 20,000 feet can be on you before you can even name it. Your window of reaction shrinks to seconds. Your situational awareness, the one thing that kept you alive, evaporates. It's beautiful, and it's terrifying. Closer to the ground, the air thickens. The Thunderbolt's speed bleeds away, every knot lost, turning momentum into drag and making that heavy plane an easier mark. Your throttle screams, but your ground speed crawls. Suddenly, you're a slower, more vulnerable target, an obvious bullseye for flak or a hungry fighter diving out of the sun. At those heights, there's no cushion, no second chance. The sky's mercy is gone. The margin for error is zero. One twitch of the stick, one blink, and you carve a fresh crater in a French field. At 300 miles an hour, the countryside becomes treacherous wallpaper, hedgerows like razor blades, church steeples looming out of nowhere, phone wires that feel invisible until they are not. Your hands burn from the strain, your jaw clenches, every muscle waiting for the next unseen threat. It's not courage so much as constant calculation: fly the line, hold the throttle, bank hard enough to clear that ridge. And yet, even with lives balanced on a razor, the casualty lists kept growing. The numbers on Zemke's reports refused to lie, but Zemke stares at the brutal math on his casualty reports, and the numbers feel like a verdict. Sortie after sortie, men lost faster than they can be replaced, squadrons shrinking one patch of ink at a time. He sees names, ages, last flights. He sees empty bunks and spotless uniforms folded for sons who won't come home. The ratios are sickening loss rates that outpace training pipelines, missions that guarantee you'll burn through pilots before the season is out. The doctrine that was supposed to keep them alive reads now like a slow, inevitable sentence. He closes the folder. He asks himself a dangerous, simple question. Compared to what? He asks a simple, desperate question that cuts through the dogma. Compared to what? It sounds like a small thing, almost a whisper in a room full of commandments, but it's a shovel turned against a grave. Instead of repeating the priesthood of altitude, he lines up two cold options on a ledger: certain bleeding deaths at 20,000 feet, or a dangerous gamble down low that might actually keep men alive. The question reframes risk as relative, duty as choice, and doctrine as a hypothesis open to testing. It is the first clear, dangerous step from mourning to action. September 1943 arrives like a deadline. The casualty lists don't lie. The old gospel of altitude is killing men, and someone has to try something reckless. Major Hub Zemke studies the numbers, the empty chairs, the faces of pilots who trusted the rule and paid for it with their lives. He makes a choice that will look insane on paper: a secret experiment, a deliberate break with doctrine, quiet orders, no paper trail. 3 planes, 3 pilots, a single instruction whispered in a hangar: go down, fly the deck, and come back alive if you can. The gamble is set. Zemke pulls 3 of his best pilots aside, men with hollowed eyes and empty seats at their tables, the kind who've watched friends climb into cockpits and never come back. They gather close, helmets tucked under arms, silence thick as engine oil, no bravado, no need. He studies each face, the grief, the anger, the numb acceptance. Then he leans in and drops the bomb of a thought he can't yet voice to the world. Maybe the rule they live by is killing them. His voice is low, urgent. They listen. They know the cost. They nod. They agree to hear him out. He looks each of them in the eye and says 3 words that snap the air in the tent. Forget everything you've been trained to do. It's not a suggestion. It lands like a verdict. For a long heartbeat, there is nothing but the creak of canvas and the shuffle of boots. Men who lived by altitude and rules, suddenly hearing those rules dissolved. You can see the disbelief, the slow, hardening calculation behind their faces. Fear, yes, but also a kind of raw, desperate hope. This is a command that rewrites survival. They don't answer. They wait for what comes next. Zemke's voice drops to a hard whisper, the kind that snaps attention into focus. He lays out the mission plain and cold. After the next bomber escort, you do not climb home. No cruising at 20,000 feet. No hugging the sanctuary the manuals swear by. You peel away, you push the nose down, and you ride the deck at treetop level, fast and flat. It's illegal by doctrine, suicidal by training, and he knows it. Still, he asks them to take the risk, to trust that survival might lie where every rule says death waits, and to keep it between them. He gives them a secret, forbidden order: drop to the deck. Skim the goddamn trees. No formation, no textbook maneuvers, just low, fast, and invisible. It's madness distilled into a command. They stare at him, thinking of every instructor who'd called it suicide. But Zemke's look allows no hesitation. He looks each of them dead in the eye and strips the mission down to one brutal sentence. Just see what happens. No targets, no glory, no cover from headquarters. Drop low, survive if you can, and come home to tell me what you saw. It's a confession of desperation, and the pilots hear it as both an order and an insult. Fear flickers across their faces. Zemke watches the color drain from their faces' tight jaws, a flash of panic behind eyes that have already seen too much. You can feel the room mute around the words. This isn't a reckless suggestion, it's a breach of every rule burned into their training. Standing orders aren't abstract lines on a page here, they're the difference between being mailed a flag and coming home. And yet the loss logs sit on his desk like accusations. They've buried friends for following doctrine. Now the question hangs between them. Obey and likely die, or break the rules and maybe live. Zemke's voice drops low, stripped of rhetoric, just a man laying down a bet on his men. If you get court-martialed for this, I'll take the fall. It was my order. The room goes quiet. You could hear the tape on a map snapping. He isn't boasting. He's taking responsibility for a rule he knows is killing them, and offering his rank as a shield. That simple promise carries the weight of every empty bunk and every name on a casualty list. Around him, faces shift doubt, relief, anger, because this isn't a pep talk. It's permission born of sacrifice, and now they must decide. They sit in the cold light of the briefing tent and actually think about it not as a wild gamble, but as a ledger of loss no training manual can erase. Each man carries a name in his mouth, a wingman who didn't come back, a laugh that once filled the mess hall, an empty boot by a bunk. The doctrine that promised safety at altitude has become a funeral procession. The math on the casualty reports is a punch in the gut. Zemke's vow, "I'll take the fall," lands like a lifeline and a dare. For a long, heavy moment they trade looks, weighing courts-martial against certain death, and something like resolve begins to steel itself. They've all seen the emptiness at the mess table. They've all folded into funerals and watched good men never come back. So when Zemke lays the forbidden order on the line drop to the deck, forget the gospel of altitude, the room goes quiet. No rousing speeches, no chest thumping, just hard, steady looks. He promises to take the fall. They weigh that promise against the bodies in the ledger. What do they have to lose? The question answers itself. A few soft nods, a hand on a throttle, a last breath. They agree and pencil in the date, the 27th of September, 1943. On the 27th of September 1943, the moment of truth arrived. The 3 P47 seconds shepherded the last of the battered bombers home, engines ticking as the formation thinned and the big birds drifted off toward safer skies. Radio chatter was the soft static of relief. Grease-stained gloves wiped faces, and for a breath, the world seemed to be following the rules. The men had done their job. Altimeters unwound in small mechanical whispers. Then, instead of easing up and climbing for home, like every manual and instinct demanded, the three leaders held a look, nodded once a private verdict, and quietly prepared to do the unthinkable. Instead of climbing for home, the three Thunderbolts peel away from the bomber stream, a silent, defiant act. No radio chatter, no signaling, just three sets of hands on throttles, eyes fixed on a new line of flight. Engines climb, noses dip a hair, and with a shared, grim resolve they commit to the forbidden descent. They point their heavy noses down and begin a terrifying dive. Throttles forward, wind becomes a screaming wall. The earth rushes up like a painted map. In the cockpit, instruments spin and the altimeter needles unwind as though frightened, hands white on the stick. It's reckless, it's naked. Hope rules forgotten, survival chosen. The altimeter unwinds frantically. They plummet past 10,000 feet altitude, sliding away like numbers on a speeding odometer. Wind becomes a thing that hits the plane, rattling the cockpit, blurring the horizon into streaks. Hands go white on the stick as the pilots muscle the controls and G's shove blood to their feet. Radios crackle, breath short and ragged. For a heartbeat there's raw, naked fear, then a hard, calm focus. Hold the dive, hit the deck, and disappear into the trees. They scream past 5,000 feet, the altimeter a blur as the countryside explodes into a riot of hedgerows and roofs. Wind roars in the cockpit, the engine howls. For a breathless moment the horizon lurches, fields turning to streaks. Hands white on the stick, eyes locked, every inch matters as the earth rushes up to meet them. They don't stop. They drive the noses down harder, gravity clawing at their guts as the altimeters unwind and the wind roars like a freight train. Hands white-knuckled, eyes locked on a shrinking horizon, they ride the throttle past everything they were taught was suicide. Faster, lower, hairline close to the earth, until the treetops snap up beneath their wings. They level out only when the French treetops become a terrifying green blur, brushes of leaves whipping past just beneath their wings. The P-47 seconds flatten into the landscape, engines roaring, air tearing at the canopy. Every instrument is a whisper. The whole world shrinks to speed, sound, and the thin ribbon of ground rushing toward them, where startled farmers stare up in shock. They skim so low that farmers look up in stunned silence, then scramble, women clutching aprons, men dropping tools, children thrown to the dirt. The thunder of radial engines flattens the air. Dust plumes rise, scarecrows bow, cows bellow, dogs vanish into hedgerows. For a breathless moment, the countryside is all shadow and motion, then the planes are gone. At 350 miles per hour, just feet off the ground, the world compresses into a brutal, beautiful blur. Treetops whip by, fields smear into a green ribbon, and the roar in the cockpit becomes a single, white-hot focus. The rules that kept men alive at altitude simply stop working. Radar returns flood with ground clutter. Observation posts report nothing until metal and fire are already on top of them. For a heartbeat, those Thunderbolts aren't planes at all. They're ghosts sliding across the French countryside, invisible until the first tracer rips the morning air. At 350 miles an hour, inches above the trees, the world simply stops noticing them, not because they're quiet, but because they no longer fit the picture anyone is looking for. Ground crews glance up and see only a blur. Observers scratch their heads. From the air, it feels like slipping through a crack in reality. One heartbeat you're exposed, the next you're a silver flash swallowed by the landscape. That speed and that altitude turn the P-47 from a bright target into a phantom invisible to spotters, baffling to instruments, suddenly impossible to track. The reason is savage and simple. German radar designed and tuned to pick out the slow, regimented patterns of high-altitude bomber streams couldn't see something that hugged the earth. Its search beams swept the sky for big, high-flying blips. Anything flying under that envelope vanished into noise. Radar operators stared at blank screens. Ground observers reported nothing. The P-47 seconds slipped through that seam like ghosts. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's greatest technological advantage became a fatal blind spot. This wasn't luck. It was physics, design, and the brutal genius of pilots willing to break the rules. They drop until the instruments go quiet. The radar pings that once tracked them into a pale smear of static simply stop. At treetop level, the Thunderbolts slip under the radar horizon, swallowed by terrain and clutter, literally disappearing from the German screens. To the men in the cockpits, it feels like slipping through a seam in the sky. No warning chatter, no incoming vectors, just the roar of their engines and the world rushing by. In those seconds, they are not targets but phantoms, ghosts in the machine, invisible and suddenly, terrifyingly advantaged, poised to strike before anyone knows they're there. For the first time in this war, they have something no training manual ever taught them: absolute surprise. It hits them like a physical thing, a clean, terrible advantage that rearranges every risk they'd been counting on. No blips on the scopes, no crackle of warning on the radio, just miles of enemy sky that thinks it's empty. In the cockpit, discipline and fear give way to a new, fierce focus. Every man knows this moment could end in glory or a grave, but for the first time they're hunting, not being hunted, and below the tree line, opportunity waits. Roaring over a line of trees, they stumble upon a German airfield unprepared and exposed. Open tarmac stretches past shadowed hangars, fuel drums and trucks left where crews were working. A neat row of fighters sits dumbly in the sun, pilots still on the ground. For a stunned second, the pilots realize how close victory looks, and they push the throttles forward. They glimpse 4 Flu 190 seconds lined up, cowled, refueling in the open, engines cold. Kerosene stings the morning air. Pilots are nowhere. Crews are stretched thin, heads bent over wrenches. It looks like routine dawn work. It looks defenseless. In that suspended second, before a single alarm can cut loose, the Thunderbolts have already keyed their throttles. Before the ground crews could even register the distant thunder, let alone sound an alarm, the Thunderbolts were on them, appearing like a silver avalanche out of the tree line. Shadows raced across the tarmac. Men with wrenches looked up, mouths open. Fuel hoses hung mid-air. A fuel truck driver never finished his cigarette. Machine gun tracers stitched the morning, ripping through canvas and metal. Wings sheared into fire. Pilots still climbing into cockpits were slammed down by the blast of sound and heat. In the space of heartbeats, a neat line of fighters became a burning, tumbling ruin, and the quiet airfield was suddenly a scene of utter, stunned devastation. Then, the strike hits. 3 Thunderbolts scream over the tarmac and unleash a perfect, brutal ballet. 50 caliber belts ripping the German fighters to shreds. Metal coughs and explodes. Wings shred like paper. Engines spatter flame. Ground crews don't even have time to look up, only to gape as orderly rows of fighters are carved into flaming hulks in seconds. Fuel tanks erupt in geysers of fire, carcasses spitting gasoline as wings are sheared into collapsing metal. Flu 190 seconds become rolling infernos. Panels and control surfaces torn away while ground crews dive for cover, tools and hoses abandoned. Black smoke and incandescent debris turn the airfield into a sudden graveyard. And before the shock even settles, the Thunderbolts are already peeling off, racing back toward the trees. Just as quickly as they appeared, the 3 P47 seconds were gone. Slashes of silver diving back under the trees, engines a roar, and then a whisper. On the ground, men scrambled, mouths open, smoke still curling where jets once sat. There was no chase, no return fire. Only the stunned realization that something impossible had just slipped through their defenses. It was unbelievable. 3 Thunderbolts, in and out like ghosts, not a scratch. How did it work so perfectly? They hadn't stumbled into luck. They exploited an overlooked mix of physics and psychology. Flying beneath radar, screaming past flak arcs at treetop speed, and using the P-47's bulk and ruggedness as improvised armor instead of a weakness. Surprise did what doctrine couldn't. Systems designed to fight at altitude were blind to planes that refused to be seen. But the victory carried a price. They had broken the sacred rule of height, and to make this tactic reliable, They now had to learn the brutal rules of the ground. The experiment's success forced a brutal, almost scientific realization. They had stumbled onto a new physics of warfare, a way of stacking distance, speed, and surprise that no training manual had ever imagined. What looked like reckless desperation plummeting toward trees and fields actually changed the equations. Radar vanished, reaction windows shrank, and the ground itself became a weapon. Suddenly, altitude wasn't an unalloyed advantage. Being low and fast turned detection into a fantasy and returned fire into a guessing game. It wasn't magic. It was mechanics, a cold, devastating reordering of how air combat worked, and now they had to learn the rules of the ground. First, the German flak cannons are neutered. Their entire defensive system is useless. Trained to punch holes in a sky full of slow, lumbering bombers, the batteries simply cannot compute a target screaming along the treetops at 300 miles an hour. By the time the shell arcs and the fuse cooks, the Thunderbolt is already gone past the gun, past the flare, and into the next field. Observers and radar trackers blink blankly. Commanders watch instruments that say nothing while smoke and shredded airframes tell a different story. It isn't just a failure of firepower, it's a collapse of the whole defensive logic the Luftwaffe relied on. The gunners' complex calculations, the predictors, the fuse timing, the graceful math of lead and deflection were all built to shoot at ghosts on the ceiling of the sky. Those computers expected targets to be high, slow to the eye, moving on a predictable arc you could plot and fire ahead of. Up low, at 300 miles an hour, and a few dozen feet above the earth, none of that added up. The time between aiming and impact vanished. Shells arced where a plane had been, not where it was going to be. By the time they could aim and fire, the Thunderbolt was already miles past them. By the time the gunner has picked up the speck on his sight, called for the lead, adjusted his range wheels, and squeezed the trigger, the Thunderbolt is already a silver blur sliding past miles downrange and out of the firing solution. Ground batteries were built to kill lumbering, high-flying bombers. Their predictors and fuse settings assume slow vertical drops and long flight times. At treetop speed, those calculations are useless. Shells sail behind. Tracers trace empty air. What looks like chaos to the crew is surgical timing for the P47, and that unbearable speed and proximity are about to flip everything they thought they knew. Second, the P47's greatest weakness, its sheer size and weight, became its greatest strength. That bulky airframe that made it sluggish at altitude turned into armor down low. Its big radial engine and mass gave it momentum, stability, and the capacity to carry extra armor, guns, and fuel. It could bury its nose into a strafing run and keep accelerating while lighter fighters and flak splintered around it. A burst of ground fire might rip aileron fabric or crack a canopy, and the Thunderbolt still pulled out. Pilots started calling them flying tanks blunt, brutal, and almost impossible to stop while they hunted on the deck, built like a flying tank. The Thunderbolt's skin was thick, its bones heavy, a rugged airframe wrapped around a throbbing radial engine that sounded like a freight train up close. That bulk wasn't just brute force, it gave the P47 momentum and stability at treetop speeds, a living battering ram for strafing runs. Pilots trusted that armor and that engine the way infantry trust a trench. It bought seconds, shrugging off hits that would gut lighter fighters. In the new low-level war, that sheer, unforgiving weight stopped being a handicap and started being a lifeline, the very thing that let these planes survive where others would not. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful. It was a flying tank, thick-skinned, heavy-boned, driven by a radial engine that seemed to laugh at punishment. Bullets from farmhouse rifles and bursts of ground fire would pepper its flanks, shrapnel would lace the fuselage, and pilots would feel the plane shudder like a struck animal, but the engine kept turning, the controls stayed responsive, and the P-47 kept flying. That brutal resilience is what made treetop attacks possible. You could scream low over a field and take hits, and still get home. In fact, it was so sturdy it could even clip a tree branch and not fall out of the sky. In fact, the Thunderbolt's toughness wasn't theoretical, it was brutal, physical, almost obscene. Clip a tree branch at 300 miles an hour and the wing might shear and splinter, but the plane didn't simply fall out of the sky. It shrugged off shreds of wood and bark, the engine coughing, the pilot swearing, and kept flying. Wires and flak would nick and scar it. Bullets would punch holes through skin and fuel lines, and still that radial engine would thunder on. That ruggedness let pilots do the impossible, fly so close to the earth that the ground itself became a weapon, and live to tell the tale. Finally, and this is the crucial pivot, it rewrites who feels safe in the sky. The P-47's ruggedness and the new low-level tactics don't just destroy planes and airfields, they shatter a belief that altitude equals invulnerability. Suddenly the hunters become the hunted. German pilots who once ruled the high heavens now fear the ground beneath them, forced into frantic, low-altitude scraps with no room to breathe or think. That fear seeps up the chain commander's hedge, crews hide, sorties stall, and with that paralysis goes initiative. What started as a tactic becomes a psychological weapon, flipping the entire air war on its head. Suddenly, the air war's hierarchy collapses. German pilots, long bred and lauded as apex predators of the high skies, find themselves hunted. The sundive that once guaranteed a lethal advantage now delivers astonished shock. Trained to strike from above, they wake to invisible threats beneath the tree line, surprised by roaring thunderbolts that vanish as fast as they appear. Confidence curdles into panic. Tactics that were doctrine become liabilities. Where they once stalked, they are stalked. And that reversal isn't abstract, it forces them into a single, terrible choice. Fight down among the trees, where mistakes are fatal or never appear at all. Caught near the ground, German aces, the kings of the high skies, suddenly became exposed. There's no graceful turning room at treetop level. Clockwork maneuvers collapse into frantic, split-second reactions. Ailerons twitch. Prop wash becomes a hazard. A single clipped wing or a misjudged pull-up means instant catastrophe. Trees, church steeples, and unseen wires turn the horizon into a minefield. And because pilots can't peel away to climb or trade altitude for advantage, every encounter is a brutal, claustrophobic duel where one mistake kills. It flipped the psychology of air combat on its head and opened the door for something the Americans would exploit ruthlessly, using the ground itself as a weapon. They weren't just fighting in the sky anymore, they turned the ground into a weapon. By diving to treetop level, they slipped beneath radar, strafed airfields before alarms could sound, and used the Thunderbolt's brute strength like armor. What had been a liability in the clouds, size, weight, long wings, became a battering ram on the deck. The psychological shift was brutal. German pilots bred to hunt from above were suddenly exposed, hunted in a world they didn't control. It rewrote the rules of engagement overnight, and word of the tactics spread fast. Even the manufacturers started to take notice. Word spreads like tracer fire, fast, hot, impossible to ignore. Field reports and grainy eyewitness accounts make their way back to Republic Aviation, and inside its design rooms, the reaction is immediate. Curiosity hardens into urgency. Engineers hunched over blueprints stop arguing doctrine and start sketching protection where none had been planned. Factory foremen reorder parts, Pilots' frantic testimony reconfigures priorities. What was a secret, almost heretical tactic becomes a business case and a matter of survival. Within days, the P-47 stops being treated as a single-purpose escort and begins to be remade for the hell of the low-level fight. Republic aviation moves faster than doctrine assembly lines retooled overnight, engineers hunched over drawings while sheet metal men bend steel into new shapes. The P-47 stops being a pure escort fighter and starts being built like a ground tank. Belly plates where there were none, reinforced landing gear, ammo feeds beefed up, and gun sights reworked for strafing runs. Pilots climb into these modified Thunderbolts and find machines that can take a beating the old ones couldn't. What began as a furtive field experiment is now a deliberate design-shift aircraft being reshaped to survive the brutal math of low-level war. They start bolting armor plates under the P-47, like a surgeon dressing a wound, thick steel slabs riveted to the belly to shield the pilot and that mighty radial engine from ground fire. It turned the Thunderbolt into a flying breastplate. Small arms or a lucky burst might dent skin, but they no longer meant instant death. Pilots could skim the treetops and chew up flak positions with a new confidence. The plane got heavier, slower to climb, but suddenly survivable at 50 feet, its vulnerability reshaped into blunt, brutal resilience for a role no one had planned. They tore out the old gun sights, those thin, aerial-only relics built for tracking enemy fighters hundreds of feet up, and fitted the Thunderbolts with new gyroscopic sights instead. Short, brutal technology. A spinning gyro that kept the reticle steady even when the plane was shuddering through flak, whipping past trees, or pulling impossible angles at treetop speed. Suddenly, a pilot could hold a lead on a train or an aircraft on a ramp and trust what he saw. It wasn't just an upgrade. It was a scaling of the idea tools that matched a new way of fighting precision aimed at the ground at 350 miles an hour. They swapped the old dogfight sights for gyroscopic models that steadied a shaking world. Now, at 300 miles an hour and inches above the treetops, a pilot could hold a steady aim instead of guessing where to lead a target. The sight smoothed out the bounce, compensated for dive angle, and let tracers bite exactly where intended. Fewer strafing runs, less time exposed to flak and hidden threats. More destroyed fuel trucks, more shredded runways, more ruined fighters before they ever climbed. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt wasn't just tough, it was precise. That small piece of tech turned a risky stunt into a replicable weapon, and a new machine of war was born. A new machine of war is born. The Thunderbolt sheds its old life and becomes something meaner, tougher, and unapologetically brutal: the Hedgehopper. Thick armor plates, hardened guts, and new sights turn a lumbering fighter into a low-level assassin built to eat flak and laugh at branches. It trades altitude for surprise, size for survivability, and a pilot's safety net for raw, dangerous effectiveness. Up close, it's a flying tank, fast, heavy, and devastating against anything on the ground. What began as a forbidden, desperate experiment is no longer a stunt. It's a purpose-built weapon that will rewrite how they fight. What began as a furtive, almost criminal experiment by 3 desperate pilots doesn't stay secret for long. Reports come back in ragged radio bursts and cigarette smoke conversation, and the story spreads like wildfire through the fighter groups. Invisible strikes, parked 190 seconds turn to bonfires, return flights with grins and shaking hands. Commanders read the mission reports, the casualty charts, the impossible footage. What was forbidden becomes irresistible. Tactics are sketched on napkins, briefings rewritten, gunners retrained to aim at the ground, and engineers start tinkering with armor and sights. In a heartbeat, A one-off act of survival hardens into doctrine, fast, brutal, and remorseless. It worked. What started as a desperate, rule-breaking stunt by 3 pilots didn't just survive, it solved a problem. Word spread fast. Pilots came back grinning. Mechanics learned to armor bellies. Squadrons drilled treetop runs until they were instinct, and hard-headed commanders who'd once condemned the idea began to nod. The P-47's weaknesses were reframed as strengths. Tactics were written down, crews trained, supply lines adjusted. Morale climbed as losses dropped. The secret experiment became standard operating procedure, and Zemke, once a lone dissenter, now had the authority to turn a desperate gamble into an army of hedgehoppers, and by April 1944, with D-Day looming, he'd unleash hell on the Luftwaffe. By April 1944, with D-Day looming, Hub Zemke does something reckless and brilliant. He brings his fighters down to earth and teaches them to hunt like artillery. He turns the P-47 seconds into torpedo-like raiders, low, fast, unforgiving, and sends them across northern France in coordinated treetop strikes meant to bleed the Luftwaffe dry before the invasion. It stops being classic air combat. It becomes a preemptive ground war from the sky, brutal, surgical, and utterly relentless. Zemke's plan becomes reality. In a massive, single, coordinated strike, 48 Thunderbolts sweep across northern France at treetop level. They scream over hedgerows and villages, a rolling wave of metal and noise wheels of thunder that blot out the horizon. Invisible to radar, they move like a hunting pack. Fast, low, and brutally efficient, shadows skimming the fields. Their targets are dozens of supposedly safe German airfields, far behind the front lines, places where pilots thought themselves untouchable, where fuel and fighters sat in neat rows and crews went about morning routines. These Thunderbolts weren't hunting lone enemy planes anymore. They were hunting infrastructure, the quiet hubs that made the Luftwaffe lethal. Flying low, fast, and invisible to radar, the P-47 seconds would appear over fields nobody expected to be attacked, turn tarmacs into burning wreckage in seconds, and vanish before alarms could be raised, a surgical, savage answer to a war fought in the sky. They called them the Chattanooga Choo-Choo, runs a dark joke that stuck, because these missions were all about hunting the arteries of the German war machine, strafing trains, ripping up rails, cutting convoys, hitting supply depots and bridges with brutal, surgical runs from treetop level. P-47 seconds screaming in like jackals, pouring 50 caliber into anything that moved, turning once safe lines of communication into smoking, tangled wreckage, and a new kind of terror on the ground. The attacks are brutal, relentless, and psychologically devastating to the Germans. Morning routines, pilots warming engines, crews pulling chocks are ripped apart in seconds. Neat airfields become hunting grounds. Men who'd shrugged off years of war now flinch at a distant rumble. Command posts scramble. Radios choke with panicked calls, and the chain of command struggles to make sense of phantom strikes. It isn't just planes and fuel that burn. It's confidence, discipline, the very idea that the rear is rear. Dawn no longer feels safe. So when Lieutenant Robert Johnson's flight arrives with perfect timing, at one German base, Lieutenant Robert Johnson's flight arrives with perfect timing, low and silent, riding the tops of the trees like a hand sliding over a map. Engines are a muted growl, radios are off. There's no chatter, only the hard, focused breathing of men who know what they're about to do. They line up, feet from the ground, wings steady, waiting for the right instant when the world below will be exposed and helpless. In that breath between heartbeats, they see it rows of metal, unsuspecting and vulnerable, and Johnson knows there's no turning back. Johnson's flight slips over the field, and he stares down at a sight that makes his stomach drop. An entire squadron of full 192nds lined up like chrome teeth on the tarmac, wings glinting in the morning light, fuel hoses trailing, crews clustered nearby. They are perfectly exposed in open target. For a breath, the world is impossibly still. They stand in a loose circle, helmets off, maps spread across a dusty crate, laughing about the night's leave as if this morning were any other. Ground crews pass coffee cups and roll cigarettes. A sergeant points at a checklist. Someone checks a watch. The mood is small talk and routine, complacent, human, utterly ordinary. Up in the trees, the Thunderbolts are already screaming in, but down here you would never guess it. No alarms, no scramble, just men getting ready to fly. In a heartbeat, that ordinary moment will be erased. Johnson's flight peels in and opens fire with surgical brutality. Tracers lace the tarmac. Metal screams. Fuel sings and detonates. Pilots dive for cover. 11 seconds, not a minute, not even close, and it's done. The Thunderbolts scream away, leaving a smoking ruin. By the time anyone looked up, it was over. In 11 seconds, Johnson's flight turned neat rows of fighters into burning hulks, cockpits aflame, wings shredded, fuel pooling into instant fireballs. The German squadron was annihilated on the ground. No alarms, no scrambling. Not a single shot was fired back. It was over before anyone knew to fight. A quiet, brutal victory that would soon be echoed across the countryside. That scene repeats across France. In just 20 minutes, wave after wave of P47 seconds scream in low and turn every runway, hangar, and hedgerow into a target. 7 airfields hit at once, fuel dumps erupt, parked fighters burst into flames, ground crews never even reach their planes. It's fast, brutal, and utterly disorienting, leaving the Luftwaffe scrambling. It wasn't a neat setback. It was collapse. Communications frantically splinter, radar screens go dark, fogged with false echoes. Observer posts call in phantom raids. Controllers shout contradictory vectors into phones that never stop ringing. Pilots pause mid-taxi, confused by orders that arrive too late or not at all. Messengers race across airfields, with paper maps that mean nothing in the roar. Commanders stare at scrambled reports and make split-second decisions with no facts to back them up. In minutes, the smooth machine of German control turns ragged and blind. No cohesion, no coordinated defense, just panic and empty runways waiting for the next strike. Radar screens are blank. Observer posts report phantoms. There is no clear picture of the attack. Men who have spent their lives trusting metal and glass find only silence and static. Trackers peer at empty scopes, while farmhands and lookouts shout about aircraft that never show. Reports trickle in as half-sentences and rumors, each one contradicting the last. Commands that should be crisp and decisive turn into a messy chorus of guesswork. In that vacuum of certainty, the German air defense network stops being a machine and becomes a tangle. Delays multiply, priorities blur, and the ability to respond coherently unravels. Radars are blank. Observer posts cry phantom raids. Air controllers, flooded with half-truths and static, start barking orders left, right, scramble, stand down, each command canceling the last. Pilots peel off in the wrong directions. Runways clog with taxiing planes and refueling trucks chasing shadows. The whole defense fragments, crews shouting into radios that answer with chaos. Conflicting vectors send fighters into dead ends and leave others exposed on the ground. The Luftwaffe's command picture unravels, and frantic reports begin climbing the chain of command. When the stack of fragmented reports lands on the desk of Germany's top air commander, Adolf Galland, the legendary ace, the room seems to shrink around him. He studies map pins and smudged radio transcripts like a man reading a verdict, eyes moving from blank radar screens to eyewitness notes about fighters burning on the tarmac. The calm professional mask slips for a moment. His jaw tightens. A cold knot forms at the back of his neck. These are not isolated failures. These are patterns. The scattered, panicked messages suddenly add up into something far worse than bad luck, and Galen knows, with the terrible clarity of a man who's flown and bled for every inch of sky, that this is no ordinary threat. Adolf Galland feels it the moment the reports hit his desk. This is not a routine raid. The pattern: airfields burned, fighters torn apart on the ground, radar blind where it should have warned, adds up to one terrible truth. The Luftwaffe's readiness, its infrastructure, its doctrine have been pierced. If this keeps happening, squadrons will be relegated to useless museum pieces, and the air umbrella over France will collapse. Pride and professional instinct collide, and Ace knows the cost in pilots and cities. There is no time for debate. He snaps into action, convinced immediate dispersal and camouflage are the only way to save what's left. Galen doesn't hesitate. He slams a hand down on the map, voice cutting through the chaos. Disperse every aircraft, now. Hide them. Camouflage them in woods, barns, under netting. No more neat rows on open tarmacs for easy targets. Pull the flak in close to guard the fields. It's a blunt, sweeping order born of panic and clarity, a last-ditch attempt to save what's left of the Luftwaffe before the Americans can make the next run. Galland orders a scorched earth shuffle. No more neat rows of fighters on open tarmacs. Scatter them. Bury them in woods. Tuck them under barns. Drape them in camouflage nets so thick the airfields look like orchards, not runways. Mechanics hustle. Crews shovel earth. Hangar doors vanish behind hastily rigged concealment. It feels like improvisation on a war timetable, urgent, panicked, necessary, a last-ditch attempt to hide what the Americans are hunting. For a moment, the neat symmetry of the Luftwaffe is gone, replaced by a patchwork of shadows and shelter. But beneath that quick fix is a growing problem they haven't solved yet. Galen didn't stop at camouflage. He ordered flak batteries ripped from cities and factories and trucked straight to the airfields. A brutal trade-off. Towns lost a layer of protection, so runways might gain one. Convoys rumbled through the dark, crews scrambled to re-sight the big guns, and ragged, improvised belts of artillery sprang up around airstrips in a frantic attempt to blunt the new, low-level threat. It doesn't work. The German countermeasures move like a giant trying to turn slow, visible, predictable, while the Americans are already 3 steps ahead. Within days, the P47 seconds aren't just strafing runways, they're hunting the very guns meant to stop them, diving in, ripping flak positions apart before the crews can blink. Planes retooled with belly armor and new sights make low-level attacks deadly and repeatable. Recon from the resistance and fresh radio reports feed pilots exact, actionable targets. Tactics cascade. Overlapping waves, shock timing, and a refusal to play by the old rules. Every German fix only opens a new American way to exploit it. They don't flinch, they hunt. Instead of dancing around the flak, P47 seconds dive straight for it, noses down, guns spitting. Flak sites that were meant to protect airfields are shredded to splinters. With the guns gone, runways and parked fighters are exposed. By turning the enemy's defenses into the first targets, the Thunderbolts clear the sky for the next wave. They make the flak the first target. At treetop speed, they scream in, slamming guns with concentrated bursts until barrels melt and crews scatter. With the batteries silenced, they don't linger. They comb the countryside, hedgerows, barns, camouflaged revetments, ripping apart hidden aircraft before they can taxi. It becomes a brutal, surgical campaign, often aided by whispers from the French resistance. Out in the French countryside, the resistance becomes more than partisan fighters, they become the eyes of the hedgehoppers. Men and women on lonely roads watch runways and note schedules. They sketch maps of hidden dispersal sites. They mark patrol patterns with a discreet flash, a smuggled radio call, a bicycle messenger slipping past a checkpoint. That local knowledge turns treetop raids from guesswork into precision strikes. P-47 pilots no longer hunt blindly, but strike where the maps and whispers point. And because the resistance can shape what the Germans see, they begin to feed phantom reports, sending patrols on wild chases and leaving real targets exposed. Acting as the eyes for the Thunderbolts, the French resistance didn't just spot targets, they lied for them. They fed deliberately false reports into the German observer network, fabricating phantom raids, invented approach vectors, and bogus takeoff times. Radar men and ground controllers panicked over noises that weren't coming. It was deception turned into ordnance, tiny surgical lies that sent enemy patrols chasing ghosts. They fed false alarms into the German observer net, phantom raids, wrong coordinates, bogus sightings, and the Luftwaffe scrambled after ghosts. Fighters and flak were sent on dead ends, while real airfields sat exposed. Patrols ran in circles, frontline defenses chased shadows. For precious minutes, the P-47 seconds found whole bases unguarded, waiting like trapped prey. It works. Galland's sweeping commands scatter the squadrons, camouflage the strips, tuck fighters under trees and in barns, throw up nets, and move fuel away from neat rows, actually spares a lot of aircraft from becoming bonfires in those lightning strafes. Crews who would have been burned alive are suddenly hidden, runways less inviting targets, and the first wave of hedgehoppers finds fewer trophies than they hoped. For the Luftwaffe, the order buys breathing room, a hard-won, panicked reprieve. But that safety is brittle. The very measures that keep planes from burning also begin to clip their wings in a different way. But that desperate fix spawned a new, equally lethal problem. By shoving fighters into forests, barns, and under netting, Galland had saved them from the strafing runs and sentenced them to immobility. Hidden aircraft can't be refueled, rearmed, or rolled to the runway in a heartbeat. They sit like polished trophies, invisible but useless. Ground crews scramble to unearth camouflaged planes, pilots wait while minutes turn into hours, and the whole system of quick reaction collapses into log jams and confusion. In short, the Luftwaffe didn't just lose aircraft on the ground, it lost the ability to fight back. A fighter that can't be launched fast is no fighter at all. But Galland's fix hid a fatal truth. Readiness is everything. Planes tucked into barns and under nets might survive a strafing run, but the moment a scramble bell rings, you need machines that can be found, fueled, armed, and airborne in minutes, not hours. Crews had to hunt through hedgerows for camouflaged airframes. Tow trucks had to pick their way across mud. Pilots sat strapped in while minutes burned like gasoline. In a war decided by timing, that delay was deadly. A fighter that can't be quickly deployed, refueled, and launched is functionally useless, beautiful, immobile metal. Hidden in barns and under camo nets, those once proud fighters became little more than beautifully engineered museum pieces, gleaming metal that no longer served its deadly purpose. They sat idle while alarms sounded and minutes ticked away, impossible to scramble fast enough, slow to refuel, awkward to move without revealing their hiding spots. Mechanics guarded them like artifacts, not weapons. Pilots paced, frustrated, staring at machines they couldn't launch. The irony was bitter. Germany's finest engineering turned into ornaments. Removed from the fight, at the very moment the sky needed them most. And suddenly the Luftwaffe had far fewer options to respond. The Luftwaffe isn't falling in glorious duels at 20,000 feet. It's being methodically gutted on the muddy ground, strip by strip, airfield by airfield. Treetop Thunderbolts turn neat fighter lines into firestorms, fuel farms explode, hangars burn, runways are cratered into useless scars. Radar screens stay blank while German pilots scramble to hide planes that can't be quickly refueled or launched. What looks like chaos is surgical. Deny the enemy the ability to fight, and the skies are yours. It's brutal, efficient, and utterly changed the balance of power. But this new war has a dark price, terrifying hazards for the men flying it. Victory had a cost the men hadn't signed up for, a new kind of terror that lived in the spaces between treetops and telephone poles. Suddenly, the ground they used as cover became a field of hidden killers, wires like guillotines. Stray birds turned into flying shrapnel, hedgerows that could rip a wing away in an instant. Flights that had once been measured in tactics and formation timing were now measured in split seconds and blind luck. The work was brutal on the body and savage on the mind, adrenaline on a loop, nerves frayed, every run a gamble with 100 invisible hazards. The ground, their new weapon, was also their deadliest enemy. What looked like shelter from the sky became a gauntlet of hidden killers, hedgerows, church steeples, barns, and the thin hum of telephone wires strung across fields. At treetop speed, every mission turned into a life-or-death calculation. One late twitch, one unexpected gust, and you were a smoking wreck in a farmer's rye. The irony was cruel. The same terrain that let them vanish from radar also offered no mercy, no warning, and no forgiveness. Invisible hazards waited everywhere. On the next pass, something as small as a wire could end you. But the ground fights back. Power lines, strung between poles, become invisible garrotes at 400 miles per hour. You don't see them until it's too late. 1 second the horizon is clear. The next, a thin wire slashes a wing, tearing metal and sending a plane out of control. At that speed, a single ribbon of cable can turn a routine run into a deadly catastrophe. At those speeds, the ordinary turns lethal. Power lines, strung between poles, are invisible garrotes until the instant you meet one. 1 second you're slicing over a field, the next, a thin steel wire cleaves a wing clean off. The Thunderbolt yawns, the nose drops, and the world compresses into frantic gauges and a screaming wind. There's no time to think, only to fight the stick, curse, and hope the rugged frame holds. Pilots who survived remember the silence that follows, the stunned disbelief. And if a hair-thin wire can do that, a bird at 400 miles an hour becomes a flying cannonball. Even a simple bird strike becomes a lethal threat. At 400 miles an hour, a sparrow is a cannonball, a crow is a handheld bomb. Feathers and blood hit the windshield like shrapnel. Glass explodes, the cockpit goes dark for a breath you can't afford to lose. A pilot would later wake to a cockpit smeared in gore and the instant, terrifying pull-up that saved his life. One pilot still tells the story. A crow slams into his windscreen like a thrown brick, feathers and blood clouding the glass. The shock blasting him into unconsciousness for a split second. For that terrible instant, the world goes black. No trees, no wires, nothing but speed and silence. Then he jerks awake, hands locked on the controls, the cockpit a gruesome mess, and the ground rushing up beneath him. He woke just in time and yanked the stick back hard, hauling the Thunderbolt out of a fatal arc. For a breathless second, the world was nothing but a riot of glass and feathers and blood across his dash, the wind a banshee in his ears. His hands were slick, vision tunneled. instruments smeared into unreadable ghosts. Yet somehow muscle and training took over. Pull up, level off, find the sky. He lived. But the image of that splintered windscreen, the taste of metal and bird, rode him like a shadow, and it would not let him go. Beyond the physical dangers, the mental toll is immense and unsustainable for some. Flying flat out, inches above the trees, does things to a man you can't fix with armor plates. It rewires your nerves. Every twitch becomes a crisis. Sleep turns into a rumor. Adrenaline becomes a constant hum in the blood, sharpening reflexes and stealing small comforts. Pilots live in a state of taut, grinding vigilance, scanning for power lines, wires, birds, a church steeple, because one invisible obstacle can kill you. Men who once chased Messerschmitt start begging to go back up, preferring a visible enemy to a hidden killer, because the mind can only take so much. Adrenaline hits like a freight train, a cold, furious rush that tightens the jaw, hammers the heart, narrows the world to a razor-thin slice of survival. Everything outside that slice blurs away, leaving only speed, trees, and the next impossible decision. For a few glorious minutes, you can react faster than thought. Your hands an extension of instinct, your brain honed to lightning, but flown at maximum speed for hours on end, that chemical high becomes a slow, insidious tax. Muscles lock, judgment frays, tiny mistakes that wouldn't matter at rest become catastrophic, and the very focus that keeps you alive starts to eat you alive in return. Adrenaline keeps you alive, but it doesn't keep you human. Hour after hour of hair-trigger focus chews away at a man until he feels paper thin. Your eyes scan as if the landscape itself might bite. Every hedge a threat, every church spire a blade. Sounds sharpen into threats. A distant tractor becomes a bomber, a crow, a cannon. You can't blink, you can't let your mind wander for a single beat, because the price of distraction is instant and final. Sleep doesn't reset you. Jokes stop landing. Friends stop sounding like friends. The constant strain frays nerves and narrows the world to a terrifyingly thin strip of sky and earth. The long, white-knuckle runs at treetop speed eat away at even the toughest flyers. Adrenaline becomes a permanent background hum. Sleep is stolen between missions, reflexes fray, hands tremble on the stick, and tiny errors that would have been shrugged off at 20,000 feet suddenly become fatal. Pilots who once laughed off danger now wake with their hearts pounding, replaying near misses in the dark. Courage stays, but nerves don't. The constant strain turns instinct into fatigue, precision into guesswork, and pride into desperation. Some of the best begin to burn out, their nerves shot, quietly pleading for any escape from the grind. They start begging their commanders for a transfer back to the safer high-altitude dogfights. Faces that once laughed in the mess now show hollow eyes and clipped sentences. Men who lived for flying are reduced to pleading at the ops table, fingers worrying flight logs like talismans. "Give me anything but this," one mutters between clenched teeth. The commanders listen and watch the trembling hands, the jumpy flinch at every radio crackle, and feel the cruel arithmetic, a tactic that saves planes but fractures the men who fly them. It's a raw, human protest against a strategy that demands constant, lethal vigilance. They would rather face a German fighter they could see than a power line they couldn't, because with an enemy in your sights you had options. Aim, pull, fight back. Invisible threats offered no math, no evasive arc, no chance to choose. A thin wire at treetop level could shear a wing in an instant. A crow exploding through a windscreen could knock a man out cold. Hours of that kind of terror chewed at nerves and reflexes. Pilots begged for a return to honest dogfights, not from cowardice, but because the unseen killers were slowly, quietly breaking them down, and that grinding fear would soon become unbearable for some. Flying at treetop speed isn't just physically dangerous, it's a mental crucible. For hours on end, your senses are ratcheted tight, every shadow a possible death sentence. The body pumps adrenaline until your hands tremble and your mind narrows to a pinpoint. Sleep becomes a rumor. Meals don't taste like anything. The constant threat that a single invisible wire, a single startled bird, a single blink will end you turns courage into exhaustion. It grinds down even the toughest pilots until they beg for something they once scorned. A return to the safer high-altitude fights where at least you can see your enemy coming. But the invasion is coming. There is no turning back. The strategy has to work. This isn't theory anymore. It's a deadline pressed against the throats of thousands of soldiers packed into landing craft, commanders betting lives on empty skies, families holding their breath. For Zemke and his pilots, the gamble is painfully literal, a test that separates beaches full of men from beaches of bodies. Burned-out flyers, jittery from flying inches above trees and dodging invisible wires, must turn terror into razor focus. Every modified Thunderbolt, every strip of belly armor, every last strafing run will be measured in lives saved. The sky is about to be asked to do the impossible, and they have to make it answer. On June 5th, 1944, the airfields of England are a hive of activity, tents flapping, tool chests clanging, pilots hunched over maps with the same haunted look, crews running down final checklists, fuel trucks hiss, ammunition is loaded, radios calibrated, men sign last letters home. Engines cough, then purr, then roar to life like a single living thing. Everything is measured, timed, rehearsed. Nervous laughter breaks into silence. The final preparations are underway, and by dawn, the air will decide whether millions live or die. Everything about D-Day, the ships, the plans, the men rests on one razor-thin idea. This is not strategy on a map. It's the difference between a beachhead and a massacre. Thousands of landing craft, armored vehicles, and raw infantry would be funneling into a narrow, exposed shoreline. They'd be slow, they'd be crowded, they'd be sitting ducks if the sky above turned hostile. So every briefing, every scraped-together piece of intelligence, every terrified commissary clerk feeds into one calculation. The invasion can only succeed if the Allies control the air. It's that simple. It's that terrifying. On June 5th, 1944, the airfields of England hum with last-minute fury, every spare hand bent to a single purpose. Everything about the invasion ships, timing, the lives of thousands hinges on one brutal assumption: total and complete air supremacy over the beaches. If the sky isn't theirs, the landing craft become sitting ducks. If the sky isn't theirs, men in the surf are exposed to annihilation. No barrage, no convoy, no amount of bravery can save them without control of the air. So the fighters are sent out before the first boot hits sand, because in this war, the sky decides who lives and who dies. Without total control of the skies, the whole invasion is a coffin waiting to be opened. Landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder with young men, would be sitting ducks. Troops slogging up the sand would be exposed, every formation lit up for enemy fighters and strafing guns. Ships stacked offshore would become easy targets. Supplies, reinforcements, medevac, everything that keeps an invasion alive would be shredded before it even begins. That single assumption isn't military hedging. It's the difference between victory and massacre. Get the air right, and the beaches live. Lose it, and everything ashore dies. They'd staked everything on one fragile assumption: total air supremacy, would protect the men on those beaches. Before the first landing craft even scrapes the sand of the beach, that assumption is about to be made a reality. The pre-dawn sky over the channel tightens like a held breath. Engines warm, briefings end. A desperate, carefully honed plan waits only for the dark to split open a gamble born of grief, discipline, and the slim, terrible hope of surprise. June 6, 1944, 4:45 a.m. The sky over the English Channel is still dark. On the tarmac and in the cockpits, men hold their breath, engines ticking, radios whispering, eyes locked on a black horizon. It feels like the world is waiting. Then the hush breaks. At 4:45 a.m., when the sky is still dark, a deafening roar shatters the pre-dawn quiet over the English Channel. It arrives like a living wall of noise, radial engines coughing to life, throats open to maximum. Windows rattle, radar operators glance up, wakes on the water tremble. For a heartbeat, everyone thinks it's a storm. Then the shape appears, a furious line of Thunderbolts screaming toward France. Nearly 300 P47 Thunderbolts scream across the French coastline. Engines, a single savage chord that shatters the pre-dawn hush over the channel. They fly low treetop level, a rolling wall of metal and sound, a massive angry swarm of hornets. Shadows race over fields and hedgerows, farm dogs scatter. Behind the roar, these planes have one job: to wipe out the Luftwaffe on the ground before the invasion even begins. Precision routes, staggered timings, each flight a blade slicing through the dawn. For a moment the sky belongs to them, and nothing German can see it coming. They are flying at their now mastered treetop level, a massive, angry swarm of hornets. 300 Thunderbolts carve the dawn, row upon row, so low the trees seem to recoil. They move as one living thing. Engines howl, the whole coastline trembles. Pilots thread between hedgerows and church steeples, eyes locked, hands steady. Invisible to radar, impossible to counter when they hit. It will be sudden, total, and merciless. Every target had been picked like a surgeon's incision, not a random field, but every single Luftwaffe airfield within 150 miles of the Normandy beachhead, mapped, timed, and cross-checked until there were no loose ends. Recon photos, resistance tips, fuel and maintenance schedules, dawn patrol routines. It was obsession turned into a plan. The routes were plotted to funnel the Thunderbolts over the right trees at the right second, waves cued to overlap so the Germans could never recover. This wasn't chaos from the sky. It was a precise, premeditated strike designed to punch holes in Germany's air defense before they even knew to look up. They were caught completely. Utterly by surprise, German radar flickered and went blank, useless against a swarm skimming the treetops. Operators stared at empty scopes while the world outside convulsed. Routine dawn patrols taxiing for takeoff, pilots climbing into cockpits, ground crews still distracted by coffee and checklists. Then, out of nowhere, the Thunderbolts screamed over the hedgerows, metal and fire ripping neat lines of fighters on the ground to shreds before anyone could sound a full alarm. It was frantic, chaotic, immediate. By the time controllers pieced together what happened, the American assault had already vanished back into the countryside, leaving smoke and ruined runways. Across dozens of German airfields in France, the day begins in ordinary, almost sleepy motions. Crews lighting, priming pumps, mechanics sweeping dew off taxiways, pilots easing choked engines until they cough to life. Dawn patrols taxi out in neat lines, routine, practiced, untroubled. They have no idea the sky they trust has been rendered blind. Routine vulnerability, that's all it is. And routine is about to be shattered. Dawn is a blur of motion and small rituals. Pilots sling open canopies, slide into cramped cockpits, fingers finding familiar knobs, ground crews wrench on chocks, hand signals traded like private language. A mechanic wipes oil from his hands. A pilot snaps a helmet strap, takes a quick breath, checks the compass, mutters a line to himself, and the propellers begin to bite the thin morning air. It feels like routine, the same choreography they've done 1,000 times, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. In this quiet, exposed instant, they are most vulnerable, unaware that the sky above the trees is about to erupt. As ground crews pull chocks and pilots haul themselves into cockpits, something impossible happens. Thunderbolts erupt from the tree line. One moment there's routine. The next, silver streaks scream over the tarmac, surprise weaponized. They hit before the Germans can lift off, turning a dawn of preparation into sudden blazing chaos. In a heartbeat, whole lines of German fighters, neat rows of FW-190 taxiing for takeoff, were turned into raging fireballs before they could even lift off. Thunderbolts screamed out of the tree line. 50 cal belts chewing through wings and fuel tanks, turning runways into instant infernos. Pilots never finished climbing into their cockpits. Ground crews scattered in shock. It was brutal, surgical, and unnervingly quick 11 seconds from routine to complete annihilation. What began as a desperate, rule-breaking gamble has hardened into something almost surgical, an aerial orchestra, each P47 a brass instrument in a screaming band of destruction. Runs are timed to the second. Strafing passes cut like a conductor's blade. Fuel dumps ignite on cue. Hangars explode in thunderclaps of fire. Pilots peel off on perfect arcs, and the next group is already lining up, coming in from a different direction before the smoke clears. The result is relentless, enveloping chaos, no pause, no regrouping, just one rolling, unforgiving wave that leaves airfields in ruins. They hit in continuous, overlapping waves, no pause, no mercy. One flight screams in, strips an airfield bare, and before dust even settles, another surges from a different angle. Runways are cratered, fuel dumps torch, hangars collapse. It's a rolling hurricane of metal and fire, choreographed chaos that leaves the Luftwaffe no window to breathe, no chance to rally. As one flight peels off, the sky is already full of the next scream of engines. Thunderbolts slash in from new angles before the first smoke clears. There's no pause to regroup, no time to think. Runs overlap like gears in a relentless machine. The Germans never get a clean moment to recover, only roars, flames, and the constant hammer of attack. The assault never stops. Waves of thunderbolts come in like clockwork. One flight finishes its rip, pulls up, and another is already screaming in from a different bearing. There is no lull for alarms to sound, no window for scramble crews to react. Taxiing fighters are turned into targets before ground crews can move a wrench. Radar blips mean nothing when the sky itself is a killing zone. It's continuous, surgical, and brutal, so relentless the Luftwaffe is denied even a single breath. They have no time to regroup, no time to get airborne, no time to fight back. Wave after wave rips across the fields, each pass overlapping the last, leaving chaos in its wake. Ground crews scatter, control towers erupt in contradictory orders. Engines never finish warming. Pilots don't even climb. Before the Luftwaffe can form a coherent defense, their strips are ash and crater smoke rising where squadrons should have been, and the sky belongs entirely to the Allies. Hangars erupt into towering infernos, steel twisting as heat roars outward. Fuel dumps detonate in sickening orange blossoms that send shockwaves across the field, flipping service trucks and hurling debris like shrapnel. Runways crack open under the blast, Craters yawn where aircraft once lined up, radios blaze with frantic static, and control towers cough out black smoke. Pilots still climbing into cockpits are knocked back by the concussion. Crews scramble and dive for cover as flaming wreckage sheds wings and tires. For a few terrible minutes, the airfield is a maelstrom of fire and noise, and by the time anyone can even think of launching, there's nothing left to launch. By dawn, the German air response to the D-Day landings was effectively neutralized before it could even begin. Radar screens showed nothing but ghosts. Fuel dumps and hangars were smoking craters, runway thresholds torn open, and whole squadrons were pinned down, either destroyed, dispersed, or hidden and helpless. Pilots who might have climbed to contest the invasion found themselves grounded or blinded by chaos. Radio nets were choked with frantic, contradictory reports. The result was brutal and simple. The sky above Normandy was no longer contested, and the invasion's fragile first hours would be fought under Allied control. A few hours later, the sea itself seemed to boil as thousands of American soldiers spilled out of landing craft and onto Omaha's bloody sand. Ramps clanged down. Men waded through cold water, boots full, packs heavy, faces streaked with salt and smoke. Machine gun bark stitched the air. Mortars turned the surf into geysers of sand and shrapnel. Some went down in an instant. Others kept running, driven by fear and training and something fiercer still. Above them, the sky miraculously was clear. For a moment that felt impossible, the only sound louder than the guns was the pounding of thousands of hearts. They look up at the sky, every man instinctively searching the horizon, as if the clouds themselves might split open. Sand in their teeth, smoke in their nostrils, shells still spitting salt water and shrapnel around them. Hands fly to helmets, eyes narrow into slits. Someone prays, someone swears. For hours they've rehearsed this moment in nightmares, planes diving, tracers stitching the air, winged death coming to finish what the beach has started. They expect the scream of engines to turn the dawn into fire. They expect the world above them to rain death. Each heartbeat is a countdown, every face waiting for the shadow that could mean the end. They stare up, expecting a swarm of Messerschmitts to tear the sky apart. But the sky is clear, save for Allied planes. For a long, breathless second, nothing happens. No screaming engines from above, no falling tracer, just the flat, impossible blue and the distant thunder of friendly props. Men on the beaches stop and look at one another, bewildered, then break into nervous laughter. A few bow their heads and cry into sandbags. Relief rolls through them like warm water. This is what air supremacy sounds like, and in a few moments, the numbers will prove it. Numbers don't lie. They are the cold, brutal ledger that turns chaos into meaning, a ledger that, on this day, reads like a verdict. You can describe heroism, fog of war, the screams and smoke until your throat is raw, but the sums make the consequence undeniable. One side hurled everything at the beaches, the other barely answered. In the quiet after the roar, the tally of sorties and aircraft, the ratio of effort to response will show just how complete the annihilation was. Sit with that for a moment. The figures will tell you what words almost cannot. Over the course of D-Day, the Allies flew over 14,000 combat sorties over Normandy, a number that isn't just a statistic, it's the constant roar that swallowed the dawn. Planes came in endless, overlapping waves, fighters and Thunderbolts strafing airfields, bombers cratered runways, escorts carving safe lanes for the armada below. The skies were a grinding, surgical hammer, shattering German defenses before they could even scramble. Pilots flew sortie after sortie, exhausted and furious, each mission a tiny, deadly gear in a massive, coordinated machine, the air campaign that made the invasion possible. The numbers are brutal. The Allies flew over 14,000 combat sorties, and the once mighty Luftwaffe managed to muster only 319. Not a rounding error, a collapse. The sky that should have been thick with enemy fighters was almost empty. For the men on those landing craft and the soldiers on the beaches, that absence wasn't abstract math, it was survival. Planes didn't scream down to shred troops. Runways were smoldering, hangars were rubble, and the threat that had hung over Europe for years was suddenly neutered. In one day, air dominance ceased to be a theory and became a lived reality. Remarkably, the Luftwaffe's only successful actions that day were 2 reconnaissance sorties over the Allied fleet. And even those paltry probes never mattered. Allied fighters shot both out of the sky almost as soon as they lifted off, before they could warn a single gun battery. In the span of minutes, the German air arm was reduced to helpless blips on a map. The sky above Normandy belonged to the Allies. It wasn't a theory or a hope anymore. It was a brutal, literal silence that allowed thousands to storm the beaches and change the course of the war. Even the Luftwaffe's only successes were laughably short-lived. 2 reconnaissance planes that somehow slipped into the sky were cut down in an instant by waiting Allied fighters. There was no time to report, no time to warn. Both aircraft went dark before their cameras could turn, before their pilots could radio a single useful word. That single brutal fact made the battle overhead one-sided. The Allies owned the air, and with the Germans blind, the fate of D-Day was effectively sealed. The great victory of D-Day, the turning point of the war in Europe, was not won at 20,000 feet. Everyone expected the sky to decide the day. Epic dogfights, razor-sharp altitude advantages, pilots trading glory in the cold, thin air. Instead, the decisive work was done down where the earth smells of mud and diesel, by pilots who stripped doctrine to its bones and flew at treetop level, ricocheting between trees and wires, strafing runways and fuel dumps before the enemy could even react. It was rough, it was brutal, and it was brilliant, low, fast, and unexpected, the kind of audacious gamble that changes history. It wasn't won by following the established doctrine and the hallowed rules of air combat. Those sacred tenets, climb high, keep the altitude, never give up your height, sounded like wisdom on paper and like a prayer in the briefing room. But on the ground, the math was brutal, and the sky above France had turned into a slaughterhouse. Victory, it turned out, came from breaking that prayer, from punting orthodoxy and flying into danger, from trading sanctuary for surprise. Instead of 20,000 feet, the decisive fights were fought at treetop level, brutal, illegal, and utterly effective by pilots who chose survival over dogma. The turning point came not in the thin air but at 50 feet, where a handful of desperate pilots deliberately threw away the textbook. They skimmed the treetops, used the ground as armor and surprise as a weapon, trading doctrine for survival, and, in the process, wrecking whole squadrons before defenders could react. Those low, noisy raids broke the back of an air force that had ruled the high skies and, more importantly, bought time and lives for the men on the beaches. Small, brutal, and improvisational, their daring proved that rules exist to be tested when they become graves. They didn't rewrite the rulebook with ink, they tore it up with engines at 50 feet, with strafing runs and burning hangars, and with a stubborn, dangerous idea that simply refused to die. What started as a desperate gamble became doctrine. Pilots who'd been told never dive taught new pilots to hug the treetops. Tactics, training, even aircraft design shifted to fit this new reality. Commanders who once swore by altitude were forced to relearn the map of the sky. In a few short months, a handful of men changed how wars were fought, and the rest of the world had no choice but to follow. The legacy of the hedgehoppers is more than just a forgotten World War II tactic. It's a shift in mindset, proof that doctrine can be wrong, and that courage and creativity can rewrite the rules. 3 pilots flying low didn't just destroy planes. They exposed weaknesses, forced new armor and sights, and showed commanders that giving responsibility to the people at the sharp end saves lives. That experiment reshaped aircraft design, training, mission planning, and the way commanders think about risk. It seeded a culture that values adaptation over dogma, the kind of lesson that doesn't fade, it multiplies through generations of air power. It's more than a footnote or a clever trick. It's a hard-earned principle that reshaped how militaries think about air power. Design for survivability, fight where the enemy isn't looking, and trust the people closest to the fight to improvise. That idea seeped into training, procurement, and command culture. Aircraft built like tanks, tactics that weaponize terrain, commanders willing to bend doctrine when lives depend on it. It made leadership less about rigid orders and more about enabling initiative. Decades later, you can still see that DNA in the way air forces prioritize close support and give pilots the freedom to adapt under fire. Think of the P-47's lesson as a seed planted in military thinking, and then fast forward to the A-10 Warthog, its direct descendant, a flying tank built to fly low, take hits, and keep fighting. Slow, rugged, and bristling with a cannon that chews armor, the A-10 was designed to do exactly what those Thunderbolts proved: use the ground as a weapon and a shield for the troops below. It's not just hardware, it's an attitude empowering pilots to improvise, to challenge doctrine, to put survival and mission ahead of sacred rules. That through line from despair to invention is the real legacy. You can see its direct descendant in the A-10 Warthog, a modern flying tank built to do precisely what the P-47 learned to do: hug the earth, take a beating, and keep supporting the troops below. Low and slow. The Warthog loiters where the big jets can't, its armor and systems designed to shrug off small arms and flak, so ground forces get the close air support they can trust. It's not glamour, it's brutal practicality, the same tactical logic that turned a desperate, rule-breaking idea over French fields into a doctrine that still protects soldiers today. That spirit didn't die with the war, it migrated into doctrine. Today's military prizes junior leaders who think fast and break rules when the map is wrong, small unit initiative, mission command, rapid adaptation under fire. It's the same reckless, necessary creativity Hub Zemke forced out of his pilots. Improvise to survive, prioritize effect over dogma, trust the judgment of the man at the sharp end. Those instincts shorten decision loops, save lives, and turn equipment into ideas. In classrooms and briefings, commanders point to those low-level runs not just as tactics, but as proof that empowering people on the ground can change the course of a battle. Hub Zemke's story is taught not as a quirky footnote, but as a blunt lesson. Question the sacred rules, even when they come from the top. He pulled his pilots aside, gambled his career, and traded a comfortable doctrine for brutal improvisation, and it worked. That willingness to disobey, to test an idea born in the cockpit rather than in a staff meeting, saved lives and rewrote air power doctrine. Today, that same ethos empower the junior officer, reward practical thinking, be ready to unlearn what feels inviolable is part of military DNA. Sometimes the smartest orders aren't on the map. They're the ones born out of necessity at ground level. It proved a fundamental truth of warfare. Sometimes the most profound strategic breakthroughs don't come from a general's map. They arrive in the cockpit, in the mud, at the edge of what people thought survivable, born of frustration, curiosity, and the raw courage to try something heretical. A sergeant's hunch, a captain's gamble, three pilots willing to break a sacred rule. Those small, dangerous choices can overturn entire doctrines. War, like any messy human system, yields to improvisation at the margins. The people who live inside the problem often see the solution the planners never imagined. They don't come from a committee in a distant headquarters. They come from grease-stained hands and late-night briefings, from pilots staring at casualty lists and deciding the answer couldn't be more of the same. They come from commanders willing to risk court-martial for a hunch, from men who'd lost friends and refused to lose more to sacred doctrine. Innovation in war is noisy and stubborn, and born in the cracks. It's the product of desperation, stubbornness, and tiny, dangerous experiments that prove a new way is possible. That's how rules get rewritten. They come from the desperate courage of those on the front lines, the pilots who chose to hurl themselves at danger rather than wait for it to find them. Not strategy memos, not dusty maps, but young men in chipped helmets who learned to use the ground as a weapon, who turned a doctrine meant to keep them alive into the very thing that was killing them, and then broke it. Their small, brutal gamble saved lives and changed the shape of air war. It filled empty chairs and gave weary units a future. Follow for more stories of the battlefield innovations that changed history. The empty chairs in the mess hall began to fill up again. At first it was tentative, one pilot sliding into a seat, wiping grease from his hands, then another, then a small cluster of voices rebuilding the old noisy chaos. They swapped slices of bread and older jokes, but each laugh had an edge. Gratitude for being alive, grief for the men who never came back. The P-47's roar had turned from a sound of peril into a promise. Mess hall conversations turned to hedge-hopping runs, to Hub Zemke's gamble, to how breaking the rules had saved lives. The war was not over, but something fundamental had shifted. Once a lumbering target, the P-47 Thunderbolt was reborn as a flying tank, armored, armed, and terrifying at treetop level. It absorbed small arms fire like a fortress and answered with a wall of 50 caliber lead, ripping fuel dumps and lined up fighters apart in seconds. Pilots who'd once watched friends vanish at altitude now thundered over fields, invisible until it was too late. The sight and sound of a P-47 at 50 feet turned airfields into nightmares. Ground crews hid, pilots hesitated, and the Luftwaffe's confidence cracked. In short order, the Thunderbolt wasn't just surviving the war, it was making the enemy fear to fly. They didn't become aces in the way cinema imagines. There were no long, looping dogfights or dramatic tail chases. These men earned their stripes by flying blind to convention, skimming hedgerows and ripping enemy squadrons apart while they still sat on the tarmac. Mastery meant nerves of steel, split-second timing, and a steady trigger finger that could turn rows of fighter planes into burning matchsticks before anyone even knew to look up. Their tally sheets filled not with aerial duels but with strafing runs, sabotaged runways, and smoldering fuel dumps, and in doing so, they rewrote what counted as air superiority. By the time the smoke cleared, the sky itself had been redefined. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, not because someone produced a faster engine or sleeker airframe, but because a handful of pilots dared to use the ground as a weapon. Flying treetop low turned radar and doctrine into impotence, turned the lumbering P-47's weight and armor into survivability, and flipped the hunter-prey script. German aces who ruled at 20,000 feet were suddenly sitting ducks on the field. The result was air supremacy at D-Day, countless lives spared, and a stark lesson: sometimes the thing that wins a war is an idea, not a plane. That shift was more than a tactical tweak. It was proof that adaptation born from failure can rewrite history. Men who had watched friends fall at 20,000 feet stopped obeying the gospel of altitude and, by doing so, found a new kind of survival. It required humility, admitting the rulebook was wrong, and courage, letting 3 pilots test a heretical idea with the lives of many on the line. The P-47, once cursed for its size, became a flying tank. Doctrine bent around results, not tradition. In war, as in life, the winners were those willing to unlearn the sacred and invent something better under fire. It was a harsh revelation that battlefield wisdom handed down like scripture could be the very thing killing you. Zemke and his pilots didn't merely bend the rules, they unlearned them. They traded doctrine for daylight, charts for guts, and in that terrible experiment, they found a new kind of common sense. Survival sometimes demands you stop worshiping the map and start interrogating it. That lesson saved lives, shortened the war, and rewired how airmen thought about risk and initiative. It also left a quieter legacy. The organizations that survive are the ones that admit their mistakes, empower the people on the line, and actually listen when dangerous ideas come from below. For the French, the P-47's radial roar at 50 feet was not a technical marvel or a passing thunder. It was the sound of liberation itself. Farmers froze in muddy fields, church bells muffled, children ran outside, and the cramped certainty of occupation suddenly felt thin as smoke, a brutal, low-flying promise that someone had taken the fight to the enemy. That guttural engine noise meant bombs would fall elsewhere, that a row of German fighters might never rise again, that empty mess hall chairs could be filled. It proved that breaking a sacred rule could save lives, and it terrified the Luftwaffe. To the French, that low, thunderous roar meant liberation. To the Luftwaffe, it was a herald of panic, an animal sound that flipped confidence into dread. Pilots learned to flinch at the treetops. Commanders watched neat doctrine collapse into smoke and ash as parked squadrons were shredded before they could scramble. The hedgehopper tactic didn't just destroy planes and fuel it ate at morale, forced hurried camouflage and dispersal, and turned once feared German aces into hunted men on the deck. By turning the ground into a weapon, the P-47 seconds rewrote the rules of air war, and that new rule had deadly, war-ending consequences. It wasn't free. Lives were traded for a tactical revolution, young men who never came home, engines that fell silent over fields, mess halls that stayed empty another night. Still, by changing how the sky was fought, Zemke's brutal gamble shortened the war, spared countless infantry from German air attack, and turned a vulnerable fighter into a guardian for the troops below. The victory carried grief and grit in equal measure, a new doctrine carved from sacrifice. That paradox, the price paid and the lives saved, would become the stubborn proof that sometimes you have to break the rules to save the most lives. The lesson was simple and brutal. When the old maps lead to a graveyard, you stop following them and you draw a new one yourself, even if it means flying straight through hell to do it. It wasn't clever engineering or top-down orders that won the sky that summer. It was desperate pilots and one commander willing to gamble on a different truth. They traded a sacred rule for survival, and in doing so, turned humiliation into advantage, vulnerability into power. The cost was high. The payoff was higher. Lives saved, airspace seized, doctrine rewritten. A reminder that on the battlefield, courage to change the map can change history.